In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a technological revolution was taking place in Britain. Bit by bit, a newfangled concept known as the railway was taking shape, ultimately culminating in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the first fully mechanised passenger railway in the world. But while this was going on, innovators from all over the world were watching with great interest. It would not take long for the concept to spread abroad. The first tracks in the area which would become the United States were built in Lewiston, just below Niagara Falls, in 1763. Sledges running on rails were used to ease the task of dragging goods up to the top of the river buffs. Here they joined the Niagara Portage. A second set of tracks would be used to lower trucks down to the docks, lashed together with a pulley so the one would counterweight the other. In a sign of things to come, the tracks heightened tensions between the Caucasian settlers and the indigenous Seneca. It was part of a wider scheme to encourage settlement in the area by improving transport links, which until then had relied on ancient trails and Seneca porters. Indeed, 200 Seneca had previously been employed at Lewiston to carry goods up the buffs. The Seneca did not take kindly to the loss of employment and bladed attempt to displace them. They joined in Pontiac's war and ambushed the first convoy to make use of the system, killing 102 people. The early wagonways in America were short both in size and in lifespan, typically built for the transfer of large quantities of building material for particular projects, and dismantled once the building project was complete. However, more permanent railways were taking shape. In 1809, a man called Thomas Leiper was looking for a better means of moving stone from his quarries to the docks on Ridley Creek. He designed a canal, but couldn't get planning permission to build it. Instead, he began to look into building a wagonway, running on wooden rails. He conducted experiments in which he was able to pull 10,000 pounds, 4,500 kilos, with a single horse. A year later, he built a track 3/4 of a mile, 1.2 kilometres long. This was America's first wagonway intended to be permanent. It greatly streamlined the rate at which stone could be moved. However, it shut in 1828, when he was finally able to get permission to build his canal. The first permanent wagonway was the Granite Railway, designed by Gridley Bryant in 1826. Set up to move stone for the Bunker Hill Memorial, but anyone with a vehicle capable of running on the tracks could do so for a fee. In 1830, it was expanded, with an inclined section, to move full trucks down from Pine Ledge Quarry. This section still stands, and is the oldest preserved piece of track in America. The line introduced a number of innovations, such as switch tracks or points, turntables, and double-bogeyed trucks. Bryant could have made a lot of money patenting these ideas, but chose not to, believing they should be freely available to foster growth in the system as a whole. Many other similar lines began to spring up across the country, using various combinations of horses, winches, and gravity to move trucks and lighter passenger services. In 1832, the world's first urban streetcar service began in New York. At the time, the city had few paved roads, and the streets could turn into a quagmire in the winter. And so, the city laid tracks in the streets, laying rails down the middle of 4th Avenue as far as 32nd Street, dug into the road to avoid inconveniencing other road users. Even in paved sections, the tracks greatly reduced the rolling resistance of the streetcars, and could travel much faster than the omnibuses which had previously provided public transport. The idea quickly spread in America, where the wide streets and grid layout were ideally suited for streetcars. In 1834, a similar network opened in New Orleans. The network there has been running ever since, going through several forms of motive power, making it the oldest tram network in the world. When the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in Britain in 1825, it got observers interested in the concept of steam locomotives. But as in Britain, the concept was somewhat experimental. The final implementation of steam power on America's railroads would go through several false starts. One man watching Britain's development of steam transportation with great interest was Colonel John Stevens. In 1802, he built America's first steamboat, a great boost to travel due to North America's abundance of navigable rivers. He then set his mind to running similar transports on land. As early as 1815, he had been granted a charter for the construction of railroads in New Jersey, and had many plans for lines in the state, but he was never able to secure the funding to get any of them built. In 1825, he designed a prototype in the hope of gaining publicity. He built a circular section of track on his estate in Hoboken, New Jersey, on which he ran his steam carriage, the first steam train in North America. Sadly, even this was not enough to secure investment in his wider rail projects. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company was founded in 1823 to build and operate canals between New York City and the coalfields around Carbondale, Pennsylvania. But the canal could not cover the final 7 miles 11 kilometers to the mines themselves. Instead, they built a railroad to transport the coal from the mines to the docks, which began operation in 1829. The company soon became interested in steam power. Designer Horatio Allen was sent to Britain to gather information about this new technology, and to locate some locomotives suitable to run on the line. He ordered 4 locomotives to be imported from Foster Rastrick and Company, but only one would ever run on the line. Known as the Stourbridge Lion, it would be the first to run on a serving American railroad. After some testing and tinkering in New York, it was brought to the line for its first test run. Though Allen had never driven a locomotive before, he took it out on his own. He successfully completed a run of 3 miles 5 kilometers back and forth, much to the delight of thousands of spectators who gathered to watch. The train performed admirably, but it proved too heavy for the wooden rails, almost double the loading capacity which had been specified. Due to the damage done, it would never run on the line again. The DHCC became reluctant to pursue steam power, and Allen quit the company to pursue his ideas elsewhere. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, connecting the Hudson River with the Great Lakes, and creating the first navigable waterway to the area above Niagara Falls, with a number of further canals connecting boats to the upper stretches of the Mississippi. This was a great boost in New York, which became the gateway to the country's interior. Nearby Baltimore was now lagging behind, and in need of their own links to the west. Businessmen Philip E. Thomas and George Brown had both been present at the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and decided a similar line was just what Baltimore needed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad would go west from the city to link up with the Ohio River at Wheeling. It would be double-tracked to facilitate the high flow of goods and passengers. This would be America's first common carrier railroad, open to all traffic, not just goods for a specific company. Building a 380-mile, 611-kilometre railway would be no mean feat, not least because the Allegheny Mountains stood in the way. Proposals to build through the relatively flat ground in Pennsylvania were blocked by the state government, leaving them to follow the rougher route through Maryland and Western Virginia. Construction got underway in 1828, with the ground broken by Charles Carroll, the last surviving signatory of the Declaration of Independence. He later described digging that ground as the second most important thing he'd ever done. Building through the mountains would be tough, and require some bridges which would be quite innovative for the time. The Carrollton Viaduct was built in 1827 and is still in use, making it the oldest rail bridge in America and the third oldest in the world, beaten only by 2 bridges on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. When a branch to Washington was opened in 1835, the Thomas Viaduct was built over the Patapsco River, 612 feet 187 metres long, making it the longest in the US at the time, and one of the first in the world to be built on a curve. Designer Benjamin Latrobe drew criticism from observers, who believed the design would collapse under its own weight, nicknaming it Latrobe's Folly. But the bridge spectacularly proved them wrong, not just staying up, but remaining in place through the Great Flood of 1868 and Hurricane Agnes in 1972, each of which otherwise devastated the Patapsco Valley. Nonetheless, the B&O could only advance westward at a slow pace. By 1830, the first section had opened as far as Ellicott's Mills, but it would not reach the Ohio River until 1852. Due to the steep gradients and windy nature of the line, it was felt impractical for steam, and so the line was initially fully horse-driven. However, circumstances would prove steam's worth. An innovator and philanthropist called Peter Cooper had recognised the value the line would add to land in Maryland and brought whole swathes of it as near as he could to the planned route. He began flattening hills and draining swamps to make way for settlement. Whilst doing so, diggers came across a large reserve of iron ore, which he promptly had mined. Knowing that the line would not only provide a fast route to carry his iron to the docks on the markets, but also provide a direct buyer with a great need for large quantities of iron, particularly if he could persuade them about the value of steam power. He kept a quantity of this iron to himself to contribute to his latest project, Tom Thumb, a coffee pot locomotive put together from various odd parts, such as musket barrels and some small-scale steam engines he had fiddled with back in New York. In August 1830, Tom Thumb was ready for a test run, aiming to prove the line was suitable for steam. Tom Thumb was able to traverse the length of the line with ease, hitting speeds of 15 miles an hour, 24 kilometers an hour. On the return journey, Tom Thumb pulled up alongside a horse-driven rail carriage, pulled by one of the company's finest horses. The two challenged each other to a race along the 8 miles, 13 kilometers back to Baltimore. Sources differ on whether this race was pre-planned or was a spontaneous decision. The horse took an early lead, but once the engines got up to speed, it was able to rapidly gain ground, soon shooting out ahead. But then, things went wrong. Tom Thumb was equipped with a mechanical air injector to feed air into the furnace. Its drive belt slipped off, restricting the flow into the fire and bringing the engine to a halt. The horse was able to gallop past. Cooper manoeuvred the belt back into position, lacerating his hand in the process, and set off in pursuit. But by now it was too late to catch up, and the horse reached Baltimore first. Nonetheless, Tom Thumb emerged with a moral victory, proving that steam power could succeed even in the more difficult terrain of America's interior. A year later, the B&O would fully mechanise. However, it was beaten to the title of the first line to run a regular steam passenger service by the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. The line aimed to link Charleston with the cotton fields to the west of the state. The plantations, who stood to benefit most from the line, leased out a number of slaves for the construction. By 1830, they had built the first 6 miles 9 kilometres, but work in the hot Carolina sun proved backbreaking even by slave labour standards. As workers began to drop, the plantations stopped leasing them for fear of having none left to pick the cotton. The company were forced to import 1,500 white labourers to replace them, who were provided better working conditions, and the work resumed. By 1833, the 136-mile, 219-kilometre route was complete. At the time, it was the longest route in the world. Like all early lines, it was initially primarily horse-driven. This included a machine called Flying Dutchman, powered by a horse on a treadmill, capable of carrying 12 passengers. But Horatio Allen was able to persuade the company of the potential of steam engines early on. He argued that horses were as fast and as powerful as they were ever going to be, whereas steam engines had the potential for a great deal of growth. Allen was appointed chief engineer of the line and ordered the construction of an engine in a factory in New York, designed to handle the lighter loading gauge of early American lines. Known as the best friend of Charleston, it pulled its first service on Christmas Day 1830, kicking off the first regular steam rail service outside of Britain. A year later, Best Friend would explode, due to a fireman tying down the safety valve to coax more speed from the engine, though some accounts claim it was because he didn't like the sound it made. The pressure proved too much and the boiler burst, killing the fireman in the process. The engine was repaired and rebranded as Phoenix. In the process, the safety valve was adjusted to make it harder to tamper with. Nonetheless, passengers refused to travel with the engine unless a stack of cotton bales was placed between them and the boiler. In 1831, the Mowhawk and Hudson Railroad opened in New York, the first American railroad to be steam-powered from its inception, with an engine called the DeWitt Clinton pulling a train of 3 modified stagecoaches. It was designed to allow passengers and light freight to bypass a section of the Erie Canal where there were a lot of locks. On its first run, it impressed the crowds by covering the distance between Albany and Schenectady in just 38 minutes, a distance the canal would take hours or even days to accomplish. Improvements were happening fast with locomotives. In 1832, the Camden and Amboy Railroad opened between New York and Philadelphia. To run on the line, they purchased a locomotive known as John Bull from Robert Stephenson and Company. Though initially successful, engineers on the line began making improvements which would be more adapted to running in America. Longer journeys were aided by an enclosed driver's cab and tender. A bell and whistle were installed for alerting anyone who might be on the line ahead of the engine, and a headlamp was installed so they could check the way ahead even in the dark. The engine's 040 wheel arrangement had worked well on the straighter British tracks, but on the windier, lower quality tracks in the US, the train would often slip off the rails, and so a leading bogie was added to guide it round bends. This necessitated the removal of the connecting rods between the power wheels, effectively converting the 040 engine into a 420 engine. Because American railroads were on fence for most of their length, they would frequently encounter debris and stray cattle on the line, and so a special wedge known as a cowcatcher was installed to clear away lighter obstructions. Finally, engineers faced an issue that coal was less readily available in America than it was in Britain. Their steam trains would have to rely mostly on burning wood, but wood fires tend to produce a lot of sparks, which were being thrown out of the smokestack. In dry conditions, these could be very hazardous. Engineers designed a diffuser chamber, effectively an enlarged tapered smokestack, in which the sparks would be caught and burn themselves out safely. As more and more lines were built, track 2 was being upgraded. Early lines typically ran on edge rails, wooden or stone blocks, with an iron edge to reduce wear. This limited the loads which could be placed on them, but they were a necessary feature due to the low availability of iron rails. But edge rails rotted quite quickly, diminishing the quality of lines. As iron became more available, companies increasingly began to replace the edge rails with sturdier rolled iron T-rails, allowing for much larger trains to be run. By 1835, railroads were springing up across the country, as far east as Louisiana. Already, they had surpassed the length of track that had been built in Britain. The railroads were there to stay, and they would soon expand, linking together into a full network. But that is a story for next time. Thank you all for watching the first episode of my new series in which I will cover America's rail history in its entirety. If you are enjoying it so far, please leave a comment to let me know, and why not like, share and subscribe to stay updated. I am currently working on part 2, which should be with you in the next couple of months, so stick around for that. In the meantime, why not check out the rest of my channel? If you would like to support the channel further, I have links in the description to my website and my Etsy pages where you can see more examples of my artwork. I have also recently opened a merch store on TeePublic, in which I am selling a range of shirts and mugs featuring my favourite train drawings. Link to that too in the description. Which of my drawings would you like to see represented this way? Let me know in the comments below. Goodbye for now.